Hey there, and welcome back to another Universal video. And today, I want to take a walk down memory lane and reflect on what I think is a forgotten gem of the 1990s. The 1995 Emblem Entertainment film, Balto, produced by Steven Spielberg and released in 1995. And it was released at a time when animation was really finding its feet again and gaining mass appeal in Hollywood, with Balto telling the sensationalized tale of the 1925 serum run to Nome, Alaska. Within the confines of the film, Balto's an unwanted and homeless wolf dog who lives on the outskirts of Nome with his adoptive father, Boris the Goose, and his two polar bear foster brothers, Muck and Luck. Within Nome, his only friend is his love interest Jenna, a husky that lives in the town, whilst he's constantly antagonized by popular sled dog Steel. Eventually, many of the children within Nome fall ill with diphtheria, and the medicine can't be shipped or flown into Nome due to severe weather conditions, and thus, a dog sled team has to be sent out to collect the serum from the closest railway station. Balto tries out for the teams to attempt to prove himself, but his wolf heritage holds him back from being selected, and thus, he's left behind. However, after the team fails to return, he goes out alone to try and find them, with his family and Jenna in hot pursuit. He faces off with a grizzly bear, and then Steel, who tries to betray him, before taking charge of the team, embracing his wolf side to lead the team through the snow, and eventually save the day, bringing the serum to the town and becoming the hero, before being adopted by Jenna's owners and having his own happy ending. The film then ends with Rosie, the young girl whom he worked so hard to save for Jenna's sake, thanking Balto's statue as an old woman in Central Park. Quite wholesome. And for the most part, I think the movie itself is decent. It's nothing really all that special, but I do enjoy it for what it is. I think it definitely feels like a film out of time, however. And this is particularly noticeable in the animation quality. It looks kind of like a film from the 80s, and the quality would fit in quite well for that era, but as we know, animation's never really stagnant in terms of looks. They push forward always. And so, whilst for the standard of the 80s I think Balto fits very well, by the mid-90s, it does look like a bit of a home video release type of quality, a bit too low budget. Not horrible, but compared to Disney at the time, it really doesn't look all that good. The voice acting, all of that, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it, but at the same time, it's also nothing special. There's no standout performances. The script and the story, it's serviceable, but it's not exactly setting itself apart or anything like that. It plays things safe, and, that's okay, but at the same time, I don't think you can make a truly great film with a script that plays it safe. You need something more. And then the score, it's not really memorable whatsoever. And for the standards of the 90s, with Disney and the rise of Pixar, a forgettable score is very much a cardinal sin. You need those iconic songs, and it just doesn't have that. And so you end up with this film that feels very much out of its time, because it isn't hitting that same standard as the animated renaissance that kicked off the 90s. And so whilst it's not bad, it suffers, because those expectations have been heaped upon it. And you can see that play out with its critical and commercial reception. In terms of its critical success, well, critics didn't really like it. Currently sits on 56% on Rotten Tomatoes from 25 reviews. And in terms of its audience score, it sits on 70% off of 50,000 plus reviews, so it has a much wider appeal for the public. Despite this though, financially the film really didn't do that well. Had a budget of around $31 million, and yet despite that it massively underperformed at the box office and only grossed around $11 million during its theatrical run. And when it came out on home video, it did sell like hotcakes and make a lot of money back and spawned 2 direct-to-video sequels simply off its strong sales figures alone, but at the same time, you can't go past that bad first box office. Now, I've already talked a little bit in depth as to why Balto might not have done so well at the box office. The style and the quality for me is probably the big ones. But I also do think it's worth noting that 1995 was a decently big year as far as animation was concerned, and only a month before, we saw the release of Toy Story, which would go on to gross $363 million off a budget of $30 million just as well. And I guess the argument can be made that when choosing between a film that's revolutionizing animation using 3D CG graphics, and a low-tier traditional animation that looks like it's made for video, there's really no choice at all. You know which one you're going to see. And so I also think that contributed quite heavily to the film's poor financial record, and indeed was probably the final straw for the studio, which would close by 1997, with all 250 of its crew members joining DreamWorks, which you could pretty much consider as its successor studio. But of course, once it was on home video, it was still able to make that fair amount of money, and that's probably because it was far more accessible than Disney films, which aren't always being sold. That's the era of the vault. And on top of that, realistically the film was probably cheaper to buy as well. And because it became so popular on home video, it did have a somewhat rehabilitated image, the same way as The Emperor's New Groove and The Road to El Dorado were also able to rehab their own poor critical and commercial reception through video sales, and thus became firm cult classics in the modern age. But what about the critical response? How does that get explained away? Because whilst the film isn't all that great, it's not that bad either. It's a fun little film, but it got panned. And so I had to dig a little bit deeper, and perhaps part of it can be attributed perhaps to a lack of historical accuracy. From what I understand, this film frames Balto as the overall hero, a champion dog that saves the day completely and utterly. However, in reality, it was a dog called Togo that undertook the most dangerous parts of the run. And you can watch an adaptation of that in Disney's Togo film starring Willem Dafoe, which is just so good. It's a really beautiful film that tugs at the heartstrings and feels like a throwback to the 90s and 2000s, where you'd have all these epic adventures with animals in lead roles. Oh, very nostalgic. So yes, go watch Togo at some point. But of course now back to Balto. And Balto did the final stretch. There's no denying that Balto was an absolute chat of a dog that had to run a long way through treacherous conditions. But on the other hand, I think people might be a bit salty that he was the only dog that really shot to fame because of the serum run, whilst the other dogs that worked just as hard were unable to get that same acclaim. But at the same time, whilst I have no doubt that this may have played into some reviewers' perceptions, for the most part, I feel like the 90s weren't really an era where many gave two shits about historical accuracy, especially when Balto still remains the most famous of the dogs to this day. I mean, he even has a statue in Central Park, for God's sake. And so, I can't really help but assume that the reason that critics didn't really gel with this film is because it didn't fit their preconceived notions of what a good animated film should look like and feel like during this time period. Aside from the lesser visual quality, the film is far more of a classic adventure type thing, instead of that fantastical and whimsical epic musical type of piece that we'd gotten used to. Pixar did blaze a new trail at this point as well, but a lot of that success had to do at first with its unique visual style. I think if the film had been traditionally animated but nothing else changed, the response would have been a bit more muted simply because of the factors I've mentioned earlier. It's the same sort of thing we've seen with Emperor's New Groove and El Dorado. They were more slapstick, silly, parody type stories that leaned heavily on pop culture, and they didn't do that well at the time of their release. But they've since become home video sensations, and their retrospective critical response is much greater as a result, especially after DreamWorks released Shrek, which I do think popularized that style of film as the main thing that animation studios would do in the 2000s. And it's a style that's still prevalent today, although it has been tweaked from time to time. And so because of that, whilst I can admit that Balto isn't a perfect film, after all it does feel outdated and is very much a sort of B-tier sort of thing, but I can't help but feel that it never really had a chance to prove itself and has been unfairly forgotten amongst the onslaught of classic films that have been released over the past, almost 30 years. So yeah, I think Balto deserves a bit better. It isn't perfect, but it doesn't suck. And so, that's the end of the video. And I would like to say that these have just been my opinions, and now I'd like to hear yours. What do you think of the film Balto? Do you like it, hate it? I'm curious for your thoughts, so make sure to like, comment, subscribe, and let me know.